All right, welcome to this explainer on the Mandanas Garcia ruling. If you've been following local governance or national economics here in the Philippines, you already know this decision is an absolute earthquake for public finance. We're talking about a ruling that fundamentally alters how billions, literally billions, in tax revenues are divided. So today, we're unpacking exactly what went down. Why did the Supreme Court step in, and how in the world did deleting just a couple of words reshape the financial landscape for every single local government unit in the country? Let's dive in. To make this whole complex ruling perfectly clear, we've broken it down into 4 quick chapters. First, the core constitutional conflict. Second, broadening the tax base. Third, the valid exclusions. And finally, the operative fact doctrine. All right, Chapter 1, the core constitutional conflict. Let's get right to the linguistic clash that started this whole thing. So, by law, local government units, or LGUs, collect their share of the national allotment based on a very specific breakdown. Municipalities grab the biggest slice of the pie at 34%, followed by provinces and cities taking 23% each, and finally, barangays get 20%. Now, the formula itself, that wasn't the issue. The real multi-billion peso question, and the exact reason petitioners like Congressman Mandanas and Garcia marched all the way to the Supreme Court, was this: a share of exactly what? And here is where we hit that core constitutional clash. You see, the 1987 Constitution explicitly guarantees LGUs a just share of all national taxes, period. But when Congress enacted Section 284 of the Local Government Code, they kind of slipped in 2 very restrictive words. They added internal revenue. They mandated that the share be taken only from national internal revenue taxes. Now, I know it sounds like super minor legal jargon, right? But financially speaking, it's a massive, massive restriction on the actual money flowing to local governments. Well, the Supreme Court didn't just let this slide. They hit back, emphasizing that Congress impermissibly departed from the exact, literal wording of the 1987 Constitution. They invoked the legal principle, verba legis non est recidendum, which essentially means, from the words of a statute, there should be no departure. The takeaway here is that while Congress definitely has the power to determine the just share, they absolutely cannot shrink the base from which that share is drawn. So, how did the Supreme Court fix this? Their solution was actually incredibly direct. They literally struck down and deleted the phrase internal revenue right out of Section 284 and all related sections of the Local Government Code. They just declared it unconstitutional and wiped it out. Moving forward, the allotment is legally understood as drawing from all national taxes.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, broadening the tax base.
Just by deleting those 2 little words, the tax pie gets much, much bigger. We are talking about massive revenue streams that were previously hoarded by the national government. This newly expanded base now legally brings in tariff and customs duties collected by the Bureau of Customs. It also ropes in 50% of the value-added taxes from the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, 60% of national wealth exploitation taxes, a whopping 85% of excise taxes from local Virginia tobacco, and even a portion of franchise taxes. Let's actually look a bit closer at the biggest addition to that list: customs duties. The Office of the Solicitor General pushed back hard on this. They argued heavily to exclude Bureau of Customs collections from the new LGU base, basically saying, hey, tariffs are just for regulating the flow of goods, not really for generating income. But the court wasn't having it. They clarified that customs duties are, in fact, taxes. They're exactions whose proceeds become public funds. Even the Customs Modernization and Tariff Act classifies its fees and charges under the blanket term of taxes. So, boom, into the LGU sharing base they go. Okay, I want you to lock this number in your mind: 3. Why? Because the newly calculated just share doesn't just pull from the current year's tax collections. By law, these allocations are based on collections from exactly 3 fiscal years prior. This 3-year lag is a super important detail because it's the secret to understanding exactly when this windfall actually reaches local communities. All right, let's pivot to Chapter 3, the valid exclusions. Now, the petitioners obviously wanted absolutely every single peso thrown into the shared pot, but the Supreme Court did draw some firm boundaries. Certain funds remain rightfully excluded from these LGU computations. Specifically, we're looking at proceeds from selling former military bases under RA 7227, certain special purpose tobacco funds, and the half of 1% of national tax collections that are earmarked for commission on audit fees. So, you might be wondering, why are these specific items excluded? Well, the Constitution actually justifies it perfectly. Article V, Section 29 clearly states that taxes levied for a special purpose must be treated as a special fund and paid out for that purpose only. It's pretty straightforward. Taxes meant for very specific targets, like those local tobacco farming funds, or auditing fees for the COA, cannot just be tossed into the general LGU sharing pot. If they did that, it would completely violate the specific purpose for which Congress levied them in the first place.
And what about the money from selling off former military bases? Well, selling a physical asset simply isn't a tax, right? It's not a fee, and it's not an exaction. Because it completely fails to meet the legal definition of a tax, keeping it out of the national taxes base just makes perfect sense.
Moving on to our final section, Chapter 4, the Operative Fact Doctrine. This right here is the ultimate multi-billion peso question. Think about it. Since the local government code's formula had been unconstitutional since the day it was enacted, way back in 1991, do the LGUs get arrears? Are they entitled to all that money they missed out on over the last 30 years? Common sense might suggest that if the national government was shortchanging them for decades, a massive refund is totally due. Well, the court actually said no, and they did this by invoking what's known as the Operative Fact Doctrine. This doctrine is really interesting because it perfectly balances strict constitutional law with everyday practical reality. It basically acknowledges that, hey, before the old law was nullified, it existed as an operative fact. The national government already spent that presumed money for decades on real-world things like roads, bridges, and national services. You can't just pretend that didn't happen. Because undoing decades of national budgets would be highly impracticable. Honestly, it'd be practically impossible. The ruling dismissed any claims for back pay. The Supreme Court declared that this decision shall have strictly prospective application, meaning it only applies moving forward. It's a rare exception to the general rule that an unconstitutional law produces no effect, but they applied it here simply as a matter of equity and fair play. So let's trace this out on a timeline. The unconstitutional law stood all the way from 1991. The court issued its initial ruling in 2018, and then finalized it in 2019. Now remember that 3-year lag rule we talked about just a minute ago? Because of that rule, the actual adjusted, expanded budgets didn't finally take effect until the 2022 budget cycle. To pull this all together for you, a few deleted words fundamentally restructured the Philippines' financial architecture. We saw an illegal restriction met with a surgical deletion by the Supreme Court. And the results? A massive tax base expansion for LGUs starting in 2022, all achieved without bankrupting the national government with decades of back pay. It's really quite an elegant solution. Ultimately, with billions more flowing automatically into local jurisdictions, the fundamental architecture of public funding has changed forever. The legal battle is over, for sure, but the practical reality? That is just beginning. The question now shifts directly to you and your community. How effectively will your local leaders utilize this constitutionally guaranteed windfall to transform the public services you rely on every day? Thanks for joining me on this explainer.